Times like when we're sitting for long periods, my neck starts bugging me. Yeah.
I may have a few questions for you as we go.
Okay. Lost about 35% of the spacing. They did the microsurgery? Yeah, that's what they did with me. Wait.
There's usually a hazing process that we.
A month off?
Go for a little bit.
Yeah, so it was like this.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Stay standing real quick, sorry. Statement of values. As we gather, we humbly seek blessings upon this meeting. May we act with strength, courage, and the will to perform our obligations and duties to our people with justice to all. Let us seek wisdom so that we may act in the best interest of our people, our neighbors, and our country. All this we ask, so may we serve. So we may serve our community with fairness and respect, putting their needs before all. Thanks.
Roll call, please.
Chairperson Ikezi,
Here.
Commissioner O'Halloran,
Here.
Commissioner Chahal,
Here.
Commissioner Jane,
Here.
Commissioner Kelly,
Here.
Commissioner Salem,
Here.
and I'm here.
Okay, we welcome Commissioner Slane. Thank you for joining us. Okay. Declaration of Commission Procedure. Public hearings are conducted by the chair in accordance with the following procedures. The chair of the commission directs all activity during the hearings. All comments shall be addressed to the commission. Any item on this agenda may be continued to a subsequent hearing. Applicants will be allotted up to 10 minutes to present and justify proposals, following staff presentation of the item. Other speakers will be given up to 4 minutes. The applicant is allotted up to 5 minutes for rebuttal of comments. No additional comments will be accepted upon the close of the public hearing, although the Commission reserves the right to direct questions to any speaker on any matter. Special procedures and time limits may be applied to any items as prescribed by the chair. Appeal of Commission actions must be filed in writing within 7 calendar days. Okay. So do we have any continuances and exceptions? Okay, since there is none, let's take up the consent calendar. We have 2 minutes and 3 consent items. Okay, Commissioner Jane.
I would just like to state that I wasn't here on October 25th, and so we'll abstain from voting on that.
Okay.
So do we have to do that separately? Do we have to pull it out separately?
No, we will just note for the record that the vote did not include you on item 5A.
Okay.
Okay. Commissioner Chahal?
I'm going to pull October 25th minutes for discussion.
All right. So we're going to pull it anyway. Anybody else on the consent calendar? All right. Okay, so let's go through, well, okay. So let's vote on consent calendar items except 5A.
Second.
Okay, any discussions? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
And for the record, did Commissioner Salem abstain from item 5B since he wasn't
Oh.
at that meeting?
Oh, yeah, thank you,
for
thank
that
you.
clarification.
Okay, so, okay. Right. Item 5A, Commissioner Jane. Oh, Chahal, sorry.
So
Good.
item number 9B, I requested some information about Summerhill project. And this is, I think, third time I'm requesting that information. Some of the traffic data was changed. And as per the council meeting, the data was changed depending on the VTA records or some record which came from the VTA. I did get an email from Mr. Andrew, but those were the same reports which were provided to us earlier. And I have been insisting like those reports do not substantiate the change of the traffic data. And I still did not get that data.
Okay, so I wasn't here for that meeting. So what I could do though is review the tape of the meeting and find out specifically what you're referring to and then provide that data for you. But you said it was from VTA, it was traffic.
Yeah, so for the Summerhill project, just give you a quick overview. Traffic studies data for Scott and El Camino, there was trips were reduced by on I think 200 counts, and the two reports, traffic study reports, which were August 16 and some other date I forgot right now, does not substantiate that. But at the council meeting, Andrew and the traffic consultant mentioned the data was changed because of some VTA data. And I have been requesting which VTA data has changed the records, changed those traffic trip studies. And that has not been provided till now. And this is my third request. If I can please request that data. I'm just requesting what the basis of that reduction of trips, which were based on VTA.
VTA data, right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Jane?
This is unrelated. This is unrelated to this item. I move that we well, I can't. I wasn't at the meeting, so I have another comment. I'm sorry.
Things on in the consent calendar or?
No.
I'll make a motion that we accept the Planning Commission minutes of November 8th with the understanding there will be follow-up on the question that Commissioner Chahal raised.
October 25th.
October 20. Oh, okay. October 25th, I'm sorry.
I second that.
Okay, any discussions? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries, but Commissioner Jane and Lan Sling abstaining. Okay. Great. All right.
Now,
So,
Chairperson Ikezi,
yes, Commissioner Jane.
there are members of the public here, and I imagine that the study session may take a while. Can we possibly move public presentations ahead of the study session?
I was going to propose that too.
Okay. Can I take a brief poll on people who are planning to speak as a member of the public? If you could raise your hand.
Public presentation.
Public presentation.
You're done. Oh, sure.
So are you, who is waiting for item 7 on the agenda, public presentations? Okay, one person. And the other 3 members, are you here for the study session? Okay, so that would be part of the public presentation. Okay,
Yeah.
great. That makes total sense. So any motion to, do we need a?
Yeah.
Okay. Any motion to change the order of items 6 and 7?
So moved. We're moving up public presentations.
A second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, let's move on to public presentations. Who would like to come up first? Okay, great. And if you'd like to state your name, please go ahead.
My name is Charlie Moon.
Okay.
I'm a local business person, and my concern is about the donation boxes. That's all over the city. Those are not regulated nor have permits, and these businesses that are out of state, or sorry, out of our city and our county, are constantly dropping them off on our property, and there's no way to get rid of them, really. So my concern is there a way to issue permits or regulate those boxes so that they are not dropped off on a private property, commercial private properties, and is left there? And that's my concern.
May I ask what the donation box is?
Those are those large blue and green donation boxes that's made for only for basically for not for what's it? It's not nonprofit, it's for profit. So my concern is that it's on private commercial properties, and they're not regulated at all. They're just dropped off middle of the night, and you call those numbers, they will never take those boxes away.
How big are those boxes?
Quite
Refrigerator,
large, up to like up to,
be larger.
yes.
Does,
And, yeah, and the other concern is that the past week, a homeless person crawled inside one of those boxes, and the fire department had to come in and had to cut that person out.
does our city attorney have a comment? Oh, okay, thank you, thank you.
So, yes, Mr. Moon and Commission, the city studied this a while back, maybe within the last 2 years, about creating an ordinance because I think it was one of the recycling firms actually requested that the city undertake a permitting process. They wanted an administrative process involved so that they can legalize the ones that were out there, since, as Mr. Moon stated, they have been placed without oftentimes the owner's consent. And so when this did go forward, I believe J.B. Matthews was actually mayor at that time, the issue kind of, didn't go the way the recycling firm wanted, and there was actually opposition that we should not be creating a new process. We do have it under, it's a conditional use for any outdoor activity or walk-up activity. And so there was no support for allowing these facilities outdoors. So essentially, any of the ones that you see out there that are, that don't have a use permit or a special permit are considered in violation of our land use regulations because they are not contained within an enclosed building. So you can report them to our code enforcement division.
I've had many times, they told me
Okay.
that they can't do anything about it.
Okay, well, I will follow up with them. We should probably take a look at, maybe be a little bit more proactive in addressing these because they were supposed to be rendered on a complaint basis, but I believe there was direction at the time to actually facilitate the staff going out there and finding these locations and notifying the owners and removing them for that very reason, so that they're not a permitted use. So they would actually stand as a code violation.
And they are a blight on the property because a lot of the homeless people go in there and fish stuff out of it and scatter it all over the floor, all over the driveway, parking structure. It's just a mess.
So we can address this with our code enforcement division, find out what approach they're taking at this point, and discuss this with the planning director or community development director, and then report back to the committee, to the commission about the action. But they are not a permitted land use unless they have a use permit. So I don't know of one instance that we've actually brought forward a use permit application. So we would have to address them as an enforcement action.
Can we add Mr. Moon to the distribution list?
Yes, and if you can leave me your contact information.
Okay.
Specific call, yeah.
Okay, so is the staff going to report back
Yes.
in the future planning commission meeting? Thank you very much.
I had a comment. my love.
Okay, Commissioner Jane.
So I'm appalled that people can just put these boxes on private property. I mean, the owner should be allowed to just tow these things away or call the city and say someone dumped trash on my property. I don't understand why we can allow people to just put something on private property. It just appalling to me.
Okay, so, and I'll check with our Mission Trail Company and our Solid Waste Department to see whether or not there's any avenue to retrieve them. So that would be one of the actual, issues involved is, can we reach somebody? Because it is very difficult to try to reach a person with these companies. But we will follow up and then report back to the planning.
We should just tow them, just like a car, if someone abandoned a car there.
I've called the police department, I called this city enforcement, and no one wants to touch them. I even tried recycling centers to come and pick them up, and no one would want to touch them either. No one wanted.
Did they say why?
They're afraid that maybe the person or the owner of the box might go after them legally, say maybe theft. But since they dump it off on a private property, it's almost like illegal dumping.
But they're on your property, so.
Exactly. So it's
legally
kind
it's
of a
yours.
gray area, yes. But they don't know that these scrap yards are even these what do they call it? Those junking. They won't even touch them.
So if you decide to use that box and donate something, then what is supposed to happen?
So what the owners do is they take all the collection that's in the box, they weigh it by the ton and they sell it overseas by the ton. So they make the money. They don't give it to any charities but themselves.
But how do they come and collect them?
They come in trucks. They come almost on a regular basis, constantly come in and take them out. So basically, they're making a profit off of the landowners and off of these people that are thinking that these donations are going to go to charities and such.
Oh, so they deposit it at like in front of a store?
No, it's a box. It's like you open the little tray, you put it inside, and it falls inside.
Oh, and then people who use that like customers for that business put things in there.
No,
anyone.
They don't want them.
Anyone.
None of those customers, none of those landowners want them.
And then they just come and take the
them,
boxes
yes.
like periodically after
Yes.
a while.
They're using your real estate for free.
Yes. And they're also using the city as in not paying taxes either for their business.
Okay, so yes, we will wait for the staff's response, and you'll be the city will follow up with you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up to our attention. Okay, anyone else like to speak on another matter, ma'am? Okay.
My concern is I received a notice, and I went to the preliminary meeting.
If you'd like to state your name, you're welcome.
Gigi Moore.
Okay.
So I received a notice, and I went to a preliminary meeting regarding 1530, 1540 Pomeroy Avenue, a residential project. They want to put in 8 townhouses in a less than half an acre of land on Pomeroy. Pomeroy is a 2-lane road. This is right before El Camino Real. There's a See's Candy, and then there's a Little Danny's Market, and beyond that, there's 2 homes. And that's where they want to put in 8 townhouses. And this Pomeroy is only a 2-lane road. So my concern is all the congestion, all the traffic that's already there, and not to mention it's just too congested as it is. So I want to bring that to the committee's attention, and I'm not sure where it's going to go from here, but I just wanted you to be aware that this is going to be coming before you soon.
Thank you, thank you. So is this the project that's in the public hearing phase? And do we have like a property, like a proposal, like right around there? Like
That's 1075 Pomeroy, and that's the 4-unit townhome project that's surrounded by the Eichler
Yeah.
condominium projects, the Pomeroy
Oh,
West,
that
Pomeroy
was,
Green.
that was a little bit while ago, but
Yeah.
many years ago, we had another
Oh, that's
development project.
1575. Yes, it's
Oh.
nearby. It's
Oh.
just a couple of properties down, but across the street.
Okay.
So yes, this one is another proposal. There's one property that's zoned agricultural, and there's another one that's medium-density residential, and there is a proposal to rezone both parcels and to put the 8 units. That's the proposal currently underway, and there is, I think what Ms. Moore is referring to is there is a notice about the notice of availability of a mitigated negative declaration is circulating now, and there's public comment. So there is a discussion about impacts related to traffic, air quality, that kind of thing in that document that you can access. But that's the first step before we come forward. That process has to run its course before we can bring it to the Planning Commission for a hearing. So that probably will be in either January or February.
Okay.
My concern is the one that you're talking about on Pomeroy, now that's closer to Benton. That's a wider part of Pomeroy. Going towards the El Camino, it narrows down to 2 lanes, and it's so congested right there.
Okay, so if I may suggest something, I really encourage a member of the public who is interested in this project to come to the Planning Commission meeting
Okay.
when it comes up. And are you within the 300? You got
The
the
300 what?
Oh no, 500 feet or 300 feet?
If she received a notice, I think we noticed to 500 feet.
It was noticed to your home. Then Ms. Moore will receive notice for the hearing
Yes.
as well.
But
So yeah.
if you'd like to come in and look at the plans and review them, I know that there was a community outreach meeting recently.
There was, and I
But-
attended that
okay.
as well. And this was brought up because there's a gentleman that lives right next door. And how are you going to have all these townhomes and all the parking in this area? Because each townhome doesn't have 1 car or 2 cars. There's more than 2 cars per family now. Or if it's a roommate situation, say Santa Clara University students, whatever, there's more than 2 cars. And this is a problem that we're having on Pomeroy because people are parking all up and down all over, even in the commercial areas.
So, Ms. Moore, I personally don't know the details about this project yet because it hasn't.
Right.
It's not. So, we're not going to be able to have an intelligent discussion today.
Okay.
So, I really would like to encourage you to come to the Planning Commission meeting when this item project is going to be on our agenda.
Okay. But I
Yes.
would like to bring it to your attention.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hey, anyone else in the public? Okay. Motion to close the public
I'll make a motion to close the public hearing.
presentation. Okay.
Second. Comments?
You need to do that? Okay. No comments? Okay. Let's move on. I don't need to do that, right? I mean, we don't need to take a vote. So let's go back to study session. Item 6.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the Commission. I'm Alexander Abbey, the Assistant City Attorney. Tonight, at the request of Commissioner Jane, I'll be giving a presentation on the broad package of bills that Governor Brown signed into law at the end of September that address the affordable housing crisis. I'm sorry?
Thank you for preparing this for us.
Oh, my pleasure. And if at any point you all have questions during this presentation, feel free to interrupt or jump in. I'm not wedded to any particular format or structure. You're, of course, all well aware of the affordable housing crisis in California as a whole. It's a problem that's particularly acute in the Bay Area and Santa Clara County in particular. This year, the state passed a series of bills with a mixed bag of tools, funding mechanisms, streamlining, oversight, and punitive measures that will potentially have at least an incremental effect on the development of affordable housing, both in Santa Clara and statewide. I've divided the bills into 6 categories. Governor Brown signed all of these into law on September 29th, 2017. I'm going to talk about the 14 that are most relevant to Santa Clara. They'll all go into effect on January 1st, 2018, with the exception, I think, of Senate Bill 2, which was passed as an urgency measure, so that one's actually already in effect. So I've broken them down into these 6 categories. The most significant bill, of course, at least in my opinion, is that first one, AB 1505. You've all heard of it. It's the restoration of the city's authority to impose inclusionary housing requirements on residential rental developments. The next 3 bills, AB 72, 879, and SB 35, make changes to the housing element process. They will require that we put more information in our housing elements. They're going to set up some monitoring requirements on our compliance with the housing elements that we adopt, and they're going to impose some penalties for non-compliance with our housing element. Next, I'm going to talk about the bills that strengthen what are called the no net loss laws. Those laws aim to prevent the city from denying housing projects or from approving projects at lower densities than what is listed in the housing element unless the city makes up the difference somewhere else. That's the idea, no net loss. If you're going to approve a low density in one spot, you have to raise the density somewhere else. So these 2 bills strengthen those laws. Next, the Housing Accountability Act. It's a similar type of law to the no net loss laws. It prohibits the city from denying a housing project if that project meets all of our general plan and zoning ordinance standards, unless the city makes specific findings that the project's going to have specific public health and safety impacts. These bills are going to make it harder for the city to make those public safety and health findings. The 5th category is new streamlined approval processes, 2 that the city can implement to help speed up housing development, and then 1 that developers can initiate if the city hasn't met its housing element targets. And then finally, I'm going to speak a little bit about just a couple bills that provide some new funding opportunities for affordable housing. So, starting at the top, first and foremost, prior to 2009, like most cities in California, Santa Clara had an inclusionary housing policy in its general plan, which said that all residential developers of 10 units or more, whether they were rental or ownership units, had to make 10% of their dwellings available to low-income households. This was one of our major tools for providing for affordable housing in Santa Clara. The other major tool, of course, was redevelopment money. But in addition to redevelopment money, inclusionary housing came to a screeching halt in 2009 with the Palmer 6th Street Properties versus City of Los Angeles case. And that was a court case that concluded that cities could not require private developers to restrict rent levels through the inclusionary housing process because that would constitute rent control. And the Costa-Hawkins Act, it's California law that prohibits rent control. We don't have rent control in California, except when somebody renews a lease. So if you have a tenant and they stay over for another year, there's some cities will cap that at 3% or something. But upon vacancy, we're not allowed to have rent control under the Costa-Hawkins Act. And so this case said that inclusionary housing for rental developments violates rent control. Didn't affect for-sale housing, so our inclusionary policy continues for for-sale housing. But with the Palmer decision, we lost one of our major tools. Meanwhile, of course, the need for affordable housing continued to grow in Santa Clara and everywhere else. And like all cities, we have an obligation to provide for affordable housing in our housing element. So we needed some remedy to address this shortfall. We were hoping for a legislative solution. Like I said, Costa-Hawkins is just a California state law, so all the legislature needed to do was pass another state law that said Costa-Hawkins doesn't apply to inclusionary housing. We almost got there in 2013 with AB 1229. To everyone's surprise, Governor Brown vetoed it. So then 3 years later, another bill, 2502, was going to do the same thing. They didn't actually reach a vote before the end of the legislative session. So in the absence of a legislative remedy, Santa Clara, like a lot of cities, look to implement a fee instead. We can adopt a nexus study that will figure out what the impact is from new development on the need for housing, and we can mitigate that with an impact fee. And we were about ready to adopt our our new affordable housing fee at the end of September, when finally the governor signed AB 1505, which explicitly overrides Palmer 9 years after the fact, and it authorizes cities to require that new rental housing include a percentage of affordable units.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So are you saying that after 2009, the city could have adopted a nexus study at any time, or was there new legislation?
At any time. It was an untested process because no one had done it at that point because no one needed to. We just thought inclusionary housing was legal. But some cities did get out sort of in the forefront and adopt nexus studies relatively quickly. Again, a lot of cities were hoping for a quick legislative remedy. If Governor Brown hadn't vetoed that law in 2013, we wouldn't have had to do a nexus study. We could have just gone back to it. But yeah, we could have done it before 2017.
I see, okay.
So Palmer was a state decision on this?
It was a state court decision. I can't remember if it was the Court of Appeal or Supreme Court, but regardless, it's a binding precedential decision. And in the wake of that, every city stopped doing inclusionary housing for rental developments. It had a huge effect on authority to impose, on the ability to build affordable housing, and then the next year we lost redevelopment. So it hasn't been a great 10 years for affordable housing development.
So I remember there was like a Supreme Court case, a U.S. Supreme Court case that was related to the affordable housing a few years back, but that.
Oh gosh.
But that has nothing to do with what we're discussing here.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about it offline. I'm
Sure.
drawing a blank. Are you thinking of? Yeah, I better not guess.
Thank you. Thank you.
Question on percentage of affordable units.
Yes.
Can city decide any percent, or what's the basis?
Well, I see you read the next bullet point. You're reading ahead. Yes, the city can decide any percentage. The city can decide 100%. But the caveat is that is almost certain to have a huge effect on the development of housing. You know, no developers are going to come to Santa Clara if we say, and by the way, every unit has to be affordable. So to address that, the statute that allows us to do inclusionary housing again says if our percentage is above 15%, we have to submit our ordinance to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, for review. And we're going to have to provide some sort of feasibility analysis to HCD to prove that there won't be a huge constraint on the development of housing if we go above that 15% number. If HCD doesn't like our proof, if they say that's going to have too much of an impediment, they can force us to go down to the 15%. But if we set it at 15% or less, HCD doesn't get involved at all. We just adopt the ordinance. And as I'm sure you're all aware, last night we introduced an ordinance at 15%. So assuming the council adopts that in January, we will have inclusionary housing for rental housing at 15% starting next year.
That's a done deal.
If the council adopts it in January, there's also, of course, a phase-in provision in the ordinance that the council considered. So it won't go into effect immediately. It'll be.
They still need to vote on it then?
Yes,
the ordinance.
there needs to be a second reading of the ordinance. They voted on it last night. It passed 6-0. But they need to, with all ordinances, there has to be 2 readings plus a 30-day period for a potential referendum, and then it goes into effect 30 days after that. But again, it has a phase-in period. It won't go into effect until July, and then only in part. I think it'll be a full year before it's fully in effect. The other big caveat in the statute that authorized this is that we have to provide for some alternative means of compliance. Inclusionary housing can't be the only way that we have inclusionary, construction of units can't be the only method of providing for inclusionary housing. We have to allow for in lieu fees or a land dedication or off-site construction or some sort of rehab of existing units. Doesn't have to be all those things. It doesn't have to be any particular one of them. We just have to provide one or more of those as options. Now, there was a lot of confusion about this point at the council meeting last night, especially from developers who stood up and said, you know, have you read AB 1505? There's this alternative requirement. You're not allowing us an alternative. We are. It's in the ordinance we wrote, but what they didn't like is that it's the city's choice. The city gets to choose, do you have to build the inclusionary units on site, or can you provide a fee or dedication instead? The developers, of course, would prefer that it's their choice because paying a fee is a lot less expensive than building the units, and they'd always like to pay less. So again, that was introduced last night. We will see whether it passes in January, but I'm feeling bullish. Commissioner Reinhardt?
Please go ahead. I think we're gonna have this a free session because I don't think we need to I don't need to recognize each person who wants to ask questions. So.
Just a quick question. Approximately what were we doing as far as inclusionary zoning, like last year, and approximately how much did we have this year on the projects? Were we getting something close to like 8 or 10%?
Well, again, we couldn't require it at all for rental developments. We could only require it
No,
for...
I understand we couldn't require it, but what were we getting? Is my question.
We had a 10%
Goal?
no, inclusionary process for, it's a policy in the general plan under our housing element. So we were imposing that on for sale property.
So, but were any of the developers offering
There
affordable?
there was voluntary contributions, and essentially it was considered a public benefit, and it helped basically sell their projects to get approval at higher densities. And so, and also there are discretionary policies in the general plan that allowed for increased densities of up to 10% with the offer of affordable housing. So sometimes the developer did offer them even on rental, like Irvine Company did. They were done as voluntary contributions or part of a development agreement.
At 15%, I would expect the developers to come back and want another floor or higher density to make it pan out.
Well, it is likely they'd be eligible for a density bonus, providing 15%. I mean, that's the flip side of it. There's actually a court case that says if the city imposes an inclusionary requirement for a whole lot of affordable housing, then by law, that developer is entitled to the density bonus that comes with providing a lot of affordable housing. We can't put that on top of our inclusionary requirement. The inclusionary requirement will make them eligible for a density bonus.
Okay.
You may be covering this later, but I know Commissioner Jane raised it last night. Is there a real definition of what an affordable unit is in terms of
Yes, there is.
coverage? So there
Oh,
is
percentages?
per
I
square
mean,
foot, square foot
Are we looking at low
size
income,
or anything
moderate?
like that? I mean, rather than just saying I've got a unit and it's a bedroom with a kitchen in it, is there any definition of what affordable units?
oh, you mean the concern that the affordable units will be not as nice as the market rate units?
Probably be units, they could be a lot smaller.
There is language in the ordinance about that. I think Commissioner Jane saw that and was not satisfied that it was specific enough, but it's something we can make more specific in future iterations of the ordinance.
Also,
if I could
if I could just
clarify.
mention that for projects, we do have our Housing and Community Development Division, actually, our Housing and Community Services Division creates what's called basically an affordable housing agreement, an AHA. And so each instance, they have to craft both the terms of the affordable units. And so with my history with the city is that there was language in the agreements for the standard contract for getting those units on board, that they had to be equivalent to the average unit that was offered. They cannot be smaller, they cannot have substandard finishes, they have to have the same features as other units. And so sometimes now the housing manager has the ability to negotiate for the affordability rate. It could be very low, moderate, So those are all varying on basically AMI, so the average, income.
medium.
And there's a percentage up to 110%. So that's negotiated depending upon how many of those units we have on board and where the most need is at. Usually it's at the lower end, but that's negotiated with the developer and the housing community services staff.
So if I could just clarify, if the units are inclusionary, they're built on-site, they can basically be no different than the other units on the property. My concern was that if we allow developers to build off-site, the wording of the ordinance says they just have to build the same number of units. So my concern was those units off-site could be shoddy, they could be micro units, because all the ordinance relates to is the number. And so I raised that concern last night. And the other issue about the density bonus, which I've brought up before, is that if somebody's building a multifamily development near transit, they've already gotten the density bonus. They've already gotten the 10%. We don't stack density bonuses. So once they've gotten the transit bonus, there's no incentive to give them a affordable bonus, because each bonus, affordability gives you 10%, or transit gives you 10%, or LEED, environmentally sustainable gives you 10%, but you can't stack them, which I have a concern about.
Well, and you're correct, you can't stack them under our current general plan. That is certainly a policy change that could be made to stack them if it's the will of the commission and the council. With respect to the off-site units, again, the ordinance requires on-site construction of inclusionary units. It allows for alternatives, including off-site units, if the city authorizes it through a development agreement. So the city will have to see the plan for the proposed alternative, including if it's off-site, and I would hope would not want to enter into a development agreement for some ramshackle substandard development. That being said, there's certainly no harm in putting language with more standards as to what those offsite units must contain as we go forward with the ordinance early next year, because I'm sure we'll be making additional revisions to that ordinance.
I have a question about the income levels.
Yes.
What are the affordability, what are they linked to? Like, what's the index linked to going forward, like plus or minus? How
area median income.
Yeah, it's set by the percentages of area median income are set in state law. I think I have it memorized, but I also have it in front of me somewhere. The area median income is set each year for the county. Above moderate income is more than 120% of AMI. Moderate income is 81 to 120% of AMI. Low income is 51 to 80% of AMI. Very low income is 31 to 50% of AMI. Extremely low income is less than 30% AMI. All right. Shall I move on to housing elements? Any more questions about?
I had one, one. So when you talked about the ability for us to choose,
Yes.
isn't that basically implying like we can force them to do it on site, which defeats the purpose of choice? Is that?
We have to provide for alternatives, and the way our ordinance is drafted, those alternatives require a development agreement so that the city can ensure that the alternatives are equivalent to what the provision of units on site would have. So I guess you're asking is it okay for us to have that level of discretion? I believe that certainly it is. The ordinance, the statute didn't say it must be all at the developer's discretion.
Okay.
I'm comfortable with the way we drafted it, but we definitely did give the city the authority rather than the developers.
Yeah, and then one other question, separate. since 2009 and 10, when this went away and when RDA went away, have we had any like funding availability for affordable developers in the city, or has it been just completely dry since that time?
We have had some funding, but it's been difficult to provide that to developers because their ability to get tax credits are also substantially changed. So HUD usually every year or with administrations changes the focus, and I'll say just going back from to say like the 90 North Winchester property, at the time HUD was providing funding for new construction of affordable housing units. During the economic downturn during 2009, the Obama administration completely reversed that and said they were only going to fund existing rehabilitation of existing housing stock, because there was, as you know, there's in places like Philadelphia and Detroit, there are thousands of housing units that are abandoned and boarded, and so the focus completely shifted. So then there's tax credits exclusively, and you have to kind of compete for those, and then the funding cycles are, you know, they're difficult to obtain funding for projects. So in our case, we needed new construction. There wasn't a lot available. Trying to get those matching funds, it was difficult. We did have some developers in the meantime able to do that, and we did have, I think Presidio was probably the last one that we actually helped fund a substantial amount, plus with the dissolution of the redevelopment agency, a lot of the money we had in available and through CDBG funds was cut. So not only did the county basically claw back those funding sources that we had available, also the CDBG funds that we relied on, which were several million a year, dried up as well. So we didn't get that. So we have a much smaller pot. I think we have about $13 million altogether, when we probably got 8 or so a year prior to that. So if not more.
And if we did in lieu fee, it would go into that pot of money?
Yes, but it's at a substantially smaller percentage as opposed to constructing it. So you wouldn't get as many units coming on board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment? So the Nexus study, and in fact this ordinance, allows us to charge in lieu fees for commercial. So we will be collecting in lieu fees for all the hotels and the commercial and light industrial and other things.
Impact fees.
Impact fees. And those would go into a fund that then we can use that money to leverage state and federal funds to get projects. And then if you recall, there was a proposal for a development at the corner of Monroe and San Tomas, which is city land. So if we offer a developer free city land, then you're providing a substantial subsidy to get the affordable housing. Is there? Okay.
All right. Let's move on to housing elements. I put the Santa Clara Arena up there just to refresh everyone's recollection. Of course, you're familiar with housing elements. It's the only portion of the city's general plan that we have to submit to the state for review. The State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, reviews our draft housing elements, provides comments on it, asks for revisions. We then revise our element. We send it back to HCD. They either ask for additional revisions, or if they like it, they will certify it as complying with state law for the planning period. The current planning period, of course, is 2015 to 2023, and we are currently in certification with HCD for our housing element. As you can see, the number is fairly significant, 4,093 units for this planning period, but with large projects like the Santa Clara Square residential project and City Place coming online, we're certainly going to meet the overall goal. The question is whether or not we'll hit the targets for the lower income categories. So the first bill to talk about is AB 1397. This will make a number of changes to the contents of housing elements. Most of this is just going to be behind the scenes. The planners are going to have to worry about this, and the consultants we hire that draft our next housing element. But it's just going to require basically a more detailed, robust housing element. One of the most important aspects of our housing element is that we have an inventory of all sites in the city that we expect to develop for housing within the next planning period. So HCD is now going to look for evidence that these are actually available for development, that there's a realistic and demonstrated potential to develop these sites. Like many cities, Santa Clara is built out. We don't have some, huge expanse of ranches or former farms that we can, just turn into housing. Everything is already developed. Everything has existing structures on it. So we can't just designate sites with existing structures. We actually have to have evidence that there's some potential for that use, whatever it is, to change. And if we've listed a site, one of these sites with an existing building or existing use, on a prior housing element, and it didn't redevelop, we're now constrained in listing that site again, unless we provide some additional analysis showing that, well, the constraints that prevented it from developing last time are no longer present. There are new size requirements for the sites in our inventory. They have to meet certain minimum and maximum size requirements. We also have to have more data on the constraints of development, like the length of time that it takes for developments to go through our process before they actually get built. Again, most of this you're not going to have to worry about because our staff and our consultants are going to have to worry about it, but it's a more thorough housing element. More detail is going to be needed in order for HCD to certify our element. And HCD is going to be much more in our face, I think, in the next several years. We have to now provide an annual housing element compliance report to HCD, detailing how well we are accomplishing our housing goals, that 4,093 number I just showed you in all those lower income categories. This was actually already on the books, this requirement for an annual report, but it didn't expressly apply to charter cities. With SB 35 now it does. So we now have to participate in this annual reporting requirement. And with AB 879, the next bill listed there, there's additional requirements for this report. We have to, have data on exactly how many applications we received, how many sites we've rezoned to accommodate our RENA, how many sites we have identified for the no net loss balance, what's the production report on our net new units, how many entitled, how many permitted, how many occupied. On an annual basis, we're going to be making this report to HCD, and if we aren't hitting our targets, HCD could decertify the housing element. And finally, AB 72, again, HCD is sort of taking on more of a watchdog role than they've taken in the past. They're now empowered to actually review any action or any failure to act by the city that HCD determines is inconsistent with the housing element. So any development project where we approve it, HCD could look at it, give us a notice that, hey, you know what, this is going to be in violation of your housing element. You have 30 days to correct this, and if we don't correct it, we'll be decertified.
So you're saying that they can step in if the project isn't big enough?
Correct. So for instance, if our housing element says 400 units can be built on this site, developer comes in and says, hey, I've got a 300 unit development I want to build here, and the city says, go for it, that's great. HCD could come in and say, no, that violates the housing element. Now, HCD can't actually stop the development. They can't undo our approval, but they could decertify the housing element because we're no longer hitting our target, or insist that you need to make that up somewhere else. Rezone another site for 100 more housing units within X number of days.
Okay, and so our housing element has to meet what standards? In other words, I know in Cupertino they put in their housing element a PG&E substation as an area of development, which I find incredible because PG&E has a substation there. Is there any teeth
that would require cities not to pick sites like that?
Well, a site that has no potential for development, basically?
Well, there's always potential. It's just unrealistic if there's a substation there.
Right. Well, it depends on the reviewer you get at HCD when you submit your housing element, but I would think that they, will be increasingly skeptical of sites that have a low potential for development. We need to have some sort of likelihood for conversion to residential, or we won't get certified.
And if they don't certify, does that mean they can step in and approve projects?
No, it just, if you're uncertified, there are certain penalties. You lose access to a lot of affordable housing funds, and as I'll be talking about a little later, there are some consequences for our ability to disapprove future housing projects that come in. It will trigger a sort of streamlined ministerial approval project for certain future housing projects. So it's not like HCD is going to take over the role of the city council or overturn a decision, but things will become more difficult for the city if we're not certified. We definitely want to stay certified.
Doesn't it seem like it's going that way year by year, though? The more cities don't really follow the directions. They're adding more rules, it seems like.
Well, that's the balance. They are using incentives and penalties to get affordable housing built. So it remains to be seen how effective all of this is. Some cities do self-certify their housing elements. They simply, HCD says you're not certified, and the city says thank you very much. We're going to self-certify, and those cities are still standing, but there are definite consequences to being uncertified.
Can I
yes.
just get a point of clarification there?
Of course.
So, like you said, HCD could decertify our housing element, and the consequences are that we would lose some affordable housing funding. And then I think you're saying that they could then just come in and increase the size of projects in the future. There's certain cities like, say, Montesrino or Atherton, where they're just not building any affordable housing. They're like, we're not going to do it. Tough luck. So are you saying that these new laws provide a lot more sort of teeth to HCD to bring those cities into compliance?
Well, yes and no. It's not that HCD is going to reach in itself and change the zoning in a city, but what it will mean is the city is now going to be in this status of being subject to streamlined ministerial review for housing development. I'll get to it a little later, but under SB 35, a developer can come into a city that's decertified, say, I've got a housing project for a site in your housing element inventory. You haven't rezoned it, but you're going to approve it within 60 to 90 days with no discretionary review. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Most cities would like to retain some degree of discretion over whether they approve projects, especially for sites that aren't even zoned residential. So I don't know all of the consequences of being decertified. And I'm not summarizing it sufficiently, but it's certainly always the goal to keep certification if possible. Let's see.
I have a question now.
Yes.
Too. Has any city or study, proceeded with, or a study been done on inverting the equation? Oh, sorry. Okay. Where a large per unit development fee was applied, but then given credits back against low-cost housing or infrastructure improvement, so that instead of mandating minimum percentages, you actually get credits for providing them. It's more of the carrot than the stick approach. Has that ever been explored? I don't know.
Well, there is the density bonus law. Under state law and under the city code, a developer can voluntarily provide more than the number of affordable units that's required. If they do, they get greater density. Also, if they come to the city and say, hey, I'd like to provide this percentage of affordable units. The city's required not only to give them a density bonus, but certain incentives toward facilitating that housing. We actually have provisions in our code where the city provides incentives to developers that provide extra affordable housing, whether that's a waiver of certain development fees or a streamlining of the process. There are actually some carrots built in. But outside the context of the development agreements where we've had a few developers provide affordable housing, it hasn't come up much in recent years in Santa Clara. But certainly there is the mechanism for providing incentives to developers, not just sticks. Okay, one other change I want to address with respect to the housing element process. We need to worry about by right development. For any site listed in our housing element inventory, if the site's not currently zoned residential, then once we rezone it, we're going to have to allow development with only ministerial review if that project is 20% affordable. You'll recall we discussed ministerial review when we were working on the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. We no longer have the ability to have a discretionary review process for accessory dwelling units. And so we tried to codify some of our design standards. We took the quantitative aspects of it and tried to put that into the ordinance so we preserved as much control as possible. Similarly here, for sites that are listed in our housing element inventory, if they're not currently zoned residential, once they're rezoned, we have to allow development by right, which means ministerial, no discretionary review, if the development is 20% very low or low income. And I've just got the first page of our site inventory from the housing element up on the screen. It's much too small to read, but all you need to see is that fourth column, which is zoning. And you'll see at the under that column, it says CT, CC, CT, 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 CC, CC, CT. They're all commercial zones. Almost all the sites in our housing inventory are commercial and will have to be rezoned residential in order to be developed, which means they will all be subject to this provision. That's under this bill, AB 1397. So as we revise our zoning ordinance in the next year, we're going to have to include ministerial provisions for review, much like we did with the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. There's also minimum density requirements for these sites. They'll have to be at least 20 dwelling units per acre, although that's not the most onerous.
Is this on our website?
That is a page of the housing element. So yeah, that's if you search for the general plan on our website, chapter 8.11, I think, or something, is the housing element. It's just listed there. You can click on it. And the entire inventory of sites, it's like 6 or 7 pages, is there. Okay.
So I'm sorry, you lost me.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So are you saying that right now in this inventory, these are zoned commercial thoroughfare?
Yes.
And if we deem to rezone them
Yes.
to residential, then it automatically becomes ministerial to approve them, meaning that we've lost all control over them?
Well, we can do ministerial review. So if we impose some standards in our new zoning ordinance that have like quantitative thresholds, we can impose those thresholds, but we can't do discretionary design review. Now, it's not all projects. It's only projects where the developer says, hey, I'm going to provide at least 20% very low income. So it looks like we're adopting an inclusionary ordinance that requires 15%. So if the developer doesn't provide that extra 5%, it becomes in at 15%. It wouldn't be subject to this. They'd still go through discretionary design review. But the housing element, the point of listing this inventory of sites is to say we intend that these be used for housing at some point during the planning period. So rezoning them to residential is what we're pledging to do in the housing element. We're not guaranteeing it, but you know, we're saying this is how we anticipate reaching our RHNA goal. We're going to rezone these sites. And when we rezone it residential, you know, residential uses are supposed to be, you know, under the permitted list. You know, permitted, it's going to be rezoned to R3, and, you know, first use is permitted residential. The only review you need for a permitted residential use under our current code is architectural review. So we're really just talking about getting rid of the discretionary design review process once these are rezoned to residential.
It's interesting, you've got the El Camino Real focus area, and I know that's under review, and I imagine it's under review for rezoning. Is that always the possibility for the city to, before somebody comes forth, to rezone it?
Well, these are not yet zoned residential. Once they are zoned residential, if somebody comes in with a 20% affordable project, then yes, they would potentially be subject to this streamlined
But what
process.
about the other way around? If before anybody comes, we're going to go ahead and rezone it?
If we rezone it residential, would they, and they come in with a 20%?
Or non-residential.
Well, we can rezone it to some,
Of our zoning, right?
I'm sorry?
We're in control of our zoning.
You are
we
in
could
control
jump
of.
ahead of.
Yes, we can still decide, you know what, we changed our mind. We're not going to do this residential. We're going to do this, choose some other category. Keep it commercial, make it industrial. But again, then we've got the no net loss laws, which we're about to get to. If we do that, if we say no residential here, then we have to identify some other sites somewhere else in the city where we will have that number of residences.
I'm sorry.
It's okay, it's very complicated, I know.
This is to interrupt you multiple times.
Laws,
Okay.
so it is confusing, believe me.
So our current ordinance
Yes.
that the council voted on last night
Yes.
was 15% affordable, which means moderate income or more affordable. This here is actually, are you saying only very low and low income?
Yes.
So already the state has this 30% density bonus for very low that people can take, I guess, ministerially. Is that correct?
If somebody comes in with a 20% very low or low, would they get the density bonus under state law? Yes.
But I think because this came up with the former Irvine, now Prometheus project, where they came in and said, well, if we do this all very low, we can put 450 units in here because we get the 30% state density bonus.
Yeah, that one is a little complicated since that's a PD rezone, and when you rezone to PD, you're saying the zoning is this plan. So I'd like to not opine on how the density bonus law applies to PD
Okay.
rezones, because that's not an easy answer.
I see.
The Irvine, now Prometheus project is mixed use. Yeah, it was, it's storage units, isn't it?
It's storage units
Yeah.
currently, and then
Right.
it was going to be
But that means that.
residential with some commercial.
I'm saying, what's the current zone, what was the current zoning at the time?
Probably commercial for those storage
Right,
units,
so,
probably.
so that wouldn't have, they couldn't have gone there unless they did a rezone. So that wouldn't have been an option. You couldn't ministerially just go in and say, we're gonna build this here because it was zoned something else
I think
on that project.
I think it's zoned for residential. I'm pretty sure it is.
Well, it couldn't have been if it was storage.
Because it's up to 37 units per acre is what it's zoned
It's
for.
the general plan that allows for the mixed use and the residential.
Yeah.
But the zoning.
I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So again, our zoning is out of sync with our general
Right.
plan. Okay.
The zoning was done at the same time the ordinance
see.
was in the 60s.
Question then.
Yes.
Our El Camino focus area development plan can change all these,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And then we start from
But
scratch.
then we're subject to the no net loss
No real loss.
for the city.
Well, yes, but I think the expectation is that the El Camino plan will provide for residential, probably in at least these numbers. If we accomplish these numbers.
Actually initiated by the opposite, because Summerhill wanted to put residential and people wanted commercial.
In which case, yes, we would have to identify sites somewhere else in the city.
And does the numbers we have right now, like Irvine companies like Bowers and Scott, they're providing some additional low-income affordable units. Will those impact, like we can reduce these numbers then? If we have higher numbers of affordability units from those?
Well, the no net loss, maybe I should just go to the no net loss slides. It's the overall number that matters. Certainly, if we go higher on one site so that we're going way over our target, and then another site comes in low, we're okay. Or at least we were okay. Under existing law, we looked at the overall number. The new law is going to require we look at each income category individually. So let me get into that a little bit. The no net loss statutes. The idea here is, suppose a very anti-development council gets elected and they say, let's stop all housing development by taking that inventory of sites and rezoning them all to one dwelling unit per acre. This statute prohibits that. That's downzoning. Government Code 65863, it prohibits from the city from downzoning sites or approving projects at lower densities than what's projected in the housing element, unless we make these two findings, that number one, the reduction is consistent with the general plan, including meeting housing element goals, and the city identifies sufficient replacement sites for the reduction. This was actually enacted in 2002. It's been on the books for a long time, to which probably makes you say, but Xander, if it's been in effect 15 years, why haven't we been following it? Well, two reasons. First, again, it only applies when we deny a project, which, it's pretty rare a project gets all the way to council for denial. Usually they'll withdraw or it gets modified first. Or when we approve it at a lower density than what's in our housing element. Those two things are pretty rare. We usually don't pull the density down for projects. But two, we have been following it, actually. These are findings which we put in the resolutions. It's in the fine print, but here's an example of a resolution for 1525 Alviso. It was a project you looked at in late 2015, and you'll see right there in the beginning, in accordance with 65863, the City Council hereby finds that the density will not affect the city's ability to accommodate its share of the regional housing need. The project that was approved was a couple units lower than what the housing element said. It was like a 40-unit townhome development. I think the housing element predicted that 42 units could be built there. And so we made these findings. Well, look, yeah, we're 2 units short, but elsewhere in the city, there's, the City Place project, the Irvine project, we're gonna make up the 2 units. Again, though, that looks at the overall number of units, 4,093. It doesn't look at each income category. So, under the revised law, that changes. We're still prohibited from downzoning sites, and we're still prohibited from approving projects at lower densities than projected in the housing element, unless we can find that the reduction for each income category with specific quantification is consistent with housing element goals. We identify specific replacement sites, and if we do have to identify replacement sites, we have to rezone them within 180 days. So it's not just, don't worry, we'll find some other sites. It's, we have to find them and rezone them, which is, it's not a small task. Because remember, rezoning is something that triggers CEQA. I mean, most CEQA review, if it's an EIR, that can take 9 months right there. We have to do this within 180 days. So, I mean, it makes, you might feel like, okay, developer, that's great that you want to build all market rate housing here, but our housing element says there's going to be, 30% affordable units here. So, we can't grant this. It's going to be too hard for us to meet our RENA goal. Besides, we'd have to do CEQA, and that's going to take months and months and months. Well, the legislature tied our hands there, too. The city cannot deny a project solely on the basis of it having insufficient affordable units. So the housing element says this site shall have 20 low income, 20 market rate. Developer comes in and says, I want to build 40 market rate units here. We can't on that basis deny the project. We can't say, sorry, it's not affordable enough. We can impose our inclusionary requirement. We can say 15% is required per our ordinance. But this prohibits us from saying, no, we got to go exactly with what the housing element is, 20 and 20. And also, in a late version of the bill, they got rid of the CEQA problem. They said, rezoning to make up the replacement sites, no CEQA review, which is kind of shocking to me. I mean, we're gonna now rezone properties as residential, which, as you know, causes some traffic issues.
Landfill.
Well, that's a possibility, within 180 days with no CEQA review. So it's kind of a big step. Anyway, so the no net loss laws are going to become more complicated. Oh, and by the way, it expressly applies to charter cities. There was some ambiguity before. There's no ambiguity now. So you're going to be seeing some complicated findings in projects going forward, and our analysis is going to get more complicated as developers come in with projects that, typically are going to be mostly market rate on sites that our housing element has affordable units for. Okay. A similar law to the no net loss laws is the Housing Accountability Act. It's in another section of the government code. This one's been on the book actually since 1982. It was called originally the Anti-NIMBY Law. Of course, you know NIMBY is not in my backyard. It applies to residential, transitional supportive, and some mixed-use projects, both market rate and affordable. Mixed-use projects, it's kind of limited. It only applies to mixed-use developments that are no more than 2 stories, where all the commercial uses are on that bottom story, and they're all stores that sort of serve the neighborhood. But basically what it does, kind of similar to the no net loss law, if any market rate housing project comes in, and if it's consistent with both the general plan and the zoning, the city can't disapprove it or reduce its density or impose conditions that make it infeasible unless we make findings that there's a specific adverse impact upon the public health and safety, and there's no feasible way to mitigate or avoid that adverse impact. That's the existing law. Now, again, it's only when a project meets all the general plan and zoning standards. So it doesn't matter whether it's on the housing element inventory or not. It applies citywide, but it has to be compliant with the zoning. And as you know, most projects that come in currently are PD rezoned, so this doesn't come into play. But maybe once the new zoning ordinance is in effect, and not every project is a PD rezone, it may be more relevant. When it's an affordable project under existing law, if it's an affordable project or if it's an emergency shelter, we can't deny it unless, again, specific adverse impact on the public health and safety, or we've already met our RHNA requirement for that income category. So a very low income project comes in and we say, you know what, we already built our 625 very low income units. We're done. It's going to be hard to make that finding. Or we have to deny it to comply with federal or state law. I don't know, maybe there's a federal law that requires, we can't build it in this site because it's too close to a waterway or something. Or if there's insufficient infrastructure, or if it's inconsistent with both the zoning ordinance and the general plan. But again, this law doesn't even apply unless it is consistent with both the zoning ordinance and general plan, so it's kind of circular. Regardless, there are changes to this law coming into effect on January 1st. First, the burden of proof. Again, we can disapprove a project that's consistent with our general plan and zoning ordinance if we find there's a specific risk to public health and safety. Currently, that's under the substantial evidence standard of review. Substantial evidence means if the city has a study showing that, if you put a housing development right on this corner, it's too risky because there's, huge amount of traffic going around that corner and they'll plow all into the house, and we have a traffic study showing that. I don't know, I'm being kind of facetious, but regardless, if the city has evidence supporting its conclusion that there's a safety risk, that's the end of the story under current law. Courts give deference to the city's determination that the evidence supports the city's conclusion. If you have substantial evidence, that's enough. Even if somebody else has their own competing study, they can have a study that says there's absolutely no risk here. Doesn't matter, a court's not going to second guess the city. If we have evidence in the record, that's the end of it. Okay, so this changes the standard of review. Instead of substantial evidence, it's now a preponderance of the evidence. So now a court will actually weigh the two studies. Well, here's a city study, here's this project proponent's study. I think the project proponent's study is more convincing. So therefore, the city, you're wrong, I'm going to overrule you.
SHD overrules?
No, that's a court. It would have, you'd actually have to go to court to get this enforced. Also, again, this applies when a project is consistent with the general plan and zoning ordinance. But the determination of whether a project is consistent with the general plan and zoning ordinance, now that burden is on the city to basically disprove the assertion that it is consistent. If a project applicant has substantial evidence that his project is consistent with the zoning ordinance and general plan, the city can come up with alternative evidence, but if the project applicant has substantial evidence, a court won't second guess that. So it's like the determination of whether a project is consistent with our own zoning ordinance and general plan has been sort of taken out of our hands. Also, under the new law, we can't make last-minute changes to the zoning ordinance general plan to avoid an approval. Somebody submits an application, and then a few weeks later, we revise our zoning ordinance. Court will look at what the zoning ordinance said before we changed it, if the Housing Accountability Act comes into play.
How does that apply to that Summerhill issue on El Camino where that we're going to hold all proposals on El Camino until we do a second review? General plan?
Well, the project itself required a rezone, I believe. So that's not a project that was consistent with the zoning ordinance and general plan. Because that one, I mean, anytime there's actually a rezone required, this project doesn't, this act doesn't come into play. As far as a project that's being held because of the pending El Camino plan, El Camino's current zoning doesn't allow for most residential. There are no projects that would be eligible for development on El Camino under this act because they're not currently consistent with our zoning ordinance because it's so stale. This law will become more relevant, though, again, once our zoning ordinance is finally up to date. You know, once there's zones that actually correspond to the general plan. Because if somebody's consistent with the zoning ordinance and general plan and comes in with an application, it's going to make it harder for us to deny a project.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
Can I ask the definition about adverse impact on public health? Because we have a number of people that come here and say, you're going to shade my property, you're going to add traffic. So does this include mental health?
A specific adverse impact on public health is defined by the statute as a significant, quantifiable, direct, and unavoidable impact based on objective, identified, written public health or safety standards or conditions as they existed on the date the application was deemed complete. So the standard's pretty high. It's pretty hard to reach that level of proof that there's really a risk to public health.
Is traffic at F level comes under that?
I would have to look at the cases interpreting this law to know whether or not a court has ever said traffic is a specific adverse impact. That's an excellent question.
Because traffic comes into CEQA, it's certainly
Of course.
significant impact. So I'm just wondering if we rezone El Camino to have a lot of residential, then basically the residents have lost all control.
Like the floodgates will be coming open under this act.
Yeah.
Almost. Well, I will look into what a definition of specific adverse impact is, but I mean,
That's a big one. Traffic.
that's a good question, though. Just a couple other changes that are coming into play. This will apply to more projects. I mentioned before that it applies to mixed-use projects, but only if it's on the ground floor, and only if it's 2 stories, and only if those are neighborhood-serving uses. Now it's pretty much any mixed-use project, as long as the residences take up at least 2/3 of the square footage of the project. Also, if somebody brings a lawsuit under this act, if we deny a project, they say, hey, you're violating the Housing Accountability Act, they bring a suit, they win, they're entitled to attorney's fees. They're also entitled to fines of $10,000 per dwelling unit that the city denied. And the court can overrule the denial, can order the city to approve a project that was denied against this law. Basically, it comes down to, it's hard to say no. I would sum up these 2 laws with these 3 questions. Number 1, is the project on a site identified in the housing element? If so, does it have the minimum number of units listed in the element? If not, we have to comply with the no net loss rules. 2, was the site rezoned after adoption of the housing element? And is the project 20% affordable? If so, then we're going to have a ministerial by right approval process. And 3, if the project is subject to the Housing Accountability Act, and the city reduces the density or denies it or renders it infeasible, we have to make one of those 5 findings, but the standard of proof has gotten skewed in favor of the applicant, and it's going to be hard to do that.
Can I?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry.
Oh, don't be. I don't have to be anywhere.
On number 2,
Yes.
here you say the project for 20% affordable.
I meant to say 20% very low.
Okay, very good.
It's not moderate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And the second question is, how will this law be affected if we went to form-based codes?
Oh,
Because we're not specifying the units per acre. We're now specifying
Yeah, I could see.
the dimensions.
If you had development standards that say like, that only allow 2 stories, where the density, say, allowed up to 50 units to the acre, you could be precluding that. I think you might fall into the no net loss category again. You couldn't just do this to all the parcels that we're trying to meet the 4,000, the RENA numbers. That's our allocation for this planning period. So there would be some, we'd have to look at that to make sure we weren't precluding the development types that are called out under the density ranges for those parcels.
Right, I'm just saying that, let's say we rezoned El Camino and we said there's a height limit of 35 feet or 45 feet, rather than saying this many units per acre, then it seems like the Housing Accountability Act wouldn't really apply because we've never specified the number of units in the element.
But by identifying those parcels that are subject to redevelopment, we have made a projection of what the potential density is at the higher limit, and then we projected for about 40% of that development area as to assure that we would meet those RENA numbers. So we would have to still look at, with those development standards, what would be the achievable unit count or approximate density in order to see whether or not we could meet the numbers that we're required to provide during the planning period.
I sort of get that, but if you went to purely form-based codes, people could either build, 10 units per acre,
yeah.
or they could build 150 units per acre, but you haven't specified that.
Well, but the form-based code is a zoning standard. It still doesn't, you still have the general plan that outlays what the density is per acre. So you still have to meld the two. The form-based code is just strictly the zoning component.
See? Okay.
But we don't have any form-based code, right?
Not right
Should.
now. Yeah.
We should.
Conceivably, that could be, if say like we rezoned all the El Camino to El Camino Real specific plan zoning and it allowed multiple types of uses, could be commercial, you'd have the flexibility of commercial or residential in different densities based upon development standards. As long as we thought we could get all those units or someplace else, then you could go ahead with that type of form-based code for the actual zoning, the development standards.
So I've got a concern, a little substantial concern about the no net loss impacts. It's an undamped equation. It's something where as you add more, you can never recover. You always must add more indefinitely until the entire city is 100-story condos, wall to wall. Is there no mitigation for changing the type of development away from a high-density solution to park or other use, mixed use, that doesn't fall into this?
Yeah, you remember that chart I put up at the beginning? It showed we have to build, or we have to provide for the potential building of 4,093 units. That's the number that was assigned to us by the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG. They got a regional number from the state. The state assigns regional numbers to each of the councils of government for the goals for those regions. ABAG then figures out for each city in its region what is a reasonable number for development. ABAG does look at each city when they make that allocation. There's a process for actually challenging the allocation if we think that it's a terrible idea. But obviously, depending on size, depending on how built out a city currently is, what ABAC thinks the potential is for development, they will assign a higher or lower number for the planning period. So presumably, if we get to a point where, you know, we've got more and more high rises, we've got less and less and less inch of land, ABAG would see that and assign lower RENA numbers. One would hope. If they assign a completely unreasonable RENA number, there is a process for challenging that. It's frequently unsuccessful when cities challenge it. I don't think Santa Clara has ever challenged their RENA, but it's supposed to be, you know, an informed guesstimate of what we can build. But it is imposed by the state and ABAG. It's not discretionary, and that's, you know, part of the state's process to get more housing built. A lot of it is mandatory measures like that. Let me get to streamlining. Now, I've mentioned this one several times already. This one probably should have just had a whole slide on SB 35 by itself because it is kind of draconian. As I mentioned several times, there's potential for loss of certification of our housing element. If our report that we now have to submit to HCD doesn't satisfy HCD, or if we just never get certified at the beginning of a compliance period. A developer can now come in and say, I've got a project, I'd like to build it on one of the sites listed in your housing element. I know it's currently zoned commercial, but your housing element says that it's got potential for residential development. I will therefore be building a residential project. Please approve this project within 60 to 90 days. Thank you. We would only have authority to do ministerial review on that project. Even though the city's zoning, the city has decided this is the good site for commercial use, does not apply. Developer can now build residential on our commercially zoned property.
Are there properties, many properties like that in Santa Clara?
Most of the properties on our housing element inventory, the properties that we listed to build 4,093 units, are zoned commercial.
Oh.
So most of the properties on our inventory would be subject to this if we lose HCD certification. Ministerial approval. Now, there are certain caveats. It has to be a certain type of infill project. It's not just every single housing project. But it just heightens why I think it's important that we stay certified. There are a couple other bills here that are also for streamlining, although it's completely at the city's discretion. The idea behind the two other bills is the city can establish a certain kind of zone or district where the city can initiate the environmental review process and rezoning for these districts. And then people who want to build housing can come in, and the property's already zoned and environmentally cleared for housing development, and there's a streamlined process. That second bill, AB 73, actually even provides for zoning incentive payments from none other than HCD. HCD will actually pay to help develop these housing sustainability districts if they meet certain requirements. There are some wrinkles as to what the size of the zone has to be, what the maximum size of it is, what the minimum and maximum density is. They have to have certain infrastructure requirements. But the idea is by establishing these zones, cities can voluntarily provide for accelerated housing development approvals, and with AB 73, receive incentive funds to do so.
Can I ask another
Please.
question? The first point here, if the city hasn't met its RENA goals.
Yes.
Now, as I see the Santa Clara's RENA's numbers are 525 extremely low units by 2023. And from last night's council meeting, it seems that out of those 525 units, the city has not built a single one to date. And same with the very low. So is this like a trajectory where we get decertified if we're not keeping track? Or at what point do we get decertified?
That remains to be seen, but it's possible we're getting close to the precipice. Like I said, all these laws go into effect January 1st. So no one's been decertified yet on this basis, but we're going to have to start doing annual reports. The annual reporting requirement says that if we submit a report that shows we're not hitting our targets, HCD could decertify us. It also says if we fail to submit a report 2 years in a row, HCD could decertify us. So, you know, in theory, we've got at least 2 years ahead of us because, you know, if we simply don't submit it the first year, apparently we don't get decertified. So I would guess we have at least a buffer of 2 years to get our acts together and provide for more low-income housing. But I'm sure a lot of cities are going to be in this boat because the reality is, you know, developers come in and want to build market rate developments, and we approve those developments. It's hard to tell a developer, you know, can't you do it half extremely low income? And under the law, we're supposed to not deny development on that basis. We're supposed to, if they want to build all market rate, we're not supposed to deny on that basis. So, yeah, I'm concerned. But I would guess we have 2 years at least.
So I'm actually concerned about AB 1397 because, you know, in an absurd example, what if a developer comes in and fills a parking lot full of tough sheds and calls it very low housing? They don't have any design review requirements. I mean, where does our ability to guide the development end in those situations where they've met these minimum requirements and just start throwing whatever they want at us?
Well, even if it's a context where they're subject to ministerial review, we have the authority to impose our design guidelines to the extent they have quantitative standards. So, you know, and certainly they'd have to meet building and fire code requirements at the very least. So there are certain minimum standards that they simply couldn't go beneath because they'd never get a building permit. We are going to be updating our zoning ordinance in the next several months to a year, and we'll presumably be putting more quantitative design standards into it to accommodate ministerial review wherever it's triggered.
So that begs the question, with
Yes.
those standards,
Yes.
is it even possible at this point to build a very low-cost housing unit?
Well,
Because, you know, we're setting a minimum bar of construction and the expense of doing the development and the land costs. Is it ever going to be possible for a developer to meet the minimum or the expected very low-income housing price given the minimum requirements? And I'm assuming we wouldn't shoot for a minimum. I think as a city, we wouldn't consider that acceptable. So
well,
where is the bottom line?
I mean, there are incentives, there are funding sources made available to developers, and they receive things like density bonuses that help make it pencil out to build affordable units in combination with their market rate units. We've had some very nice affordable units built in some of our developments. And again, these are all percentages of area median income. You know, if you're going to build a rental unit and make it affordable to very low income, that means it has to be affordable to families that are making no more than 50% of area median income, which for Santa Clara County, you know, is still not, it's not nothing. I mean, we're still going by median income. So it's possible, certainly. But I
was
hear
looking at
your...
the very low, which is 30.
I
So
think-
The extremely low is 30,
yeah,
yes. And we've had none of those, I believe.
I think the way this gets built is just like that project at the corner of Monroe and San Tomas, where the city gives the land for free. We get grants. We just passed Measure A, which is actually supposed to provide housing for 4,500 homeless people. So those are very, extremely low-income people. So presumably there's enough funds out there with all of these other bills to get these funds, and the city needs to be aggressive about applying for those grants.
Before I did solar farms, I used to build affordable housing projects for about 5 years, and knowing how advanced they are, I would strongly urge us all to pursue the in lieu fee, because the technical ability to build an affordable housing project, even if it's 10%, and the ongoing compliance requirements are so cumbersome and so complicated that most developers, they don't even know how to do it. And so you're going to be able to get more units and more easily meet the goal if you're able to fund a pot of money and then let people that do this and this exclusively leverage that money because they know exactly how to do it. I think you're going to get more bang for your buck by doing it that way. So
that's a good perspective. Thank you.
The 90 North Winchester is trying to take these things into.
The other thing, when I went to the national planning conventions in Seattle and New York, cities are basically saying, we'll allow 6 stories, but if you give us affordable housing, we'll let you go 7 or 8, whatever it is, because the biggest cost is land, and you can always go up. The question is, where can we go up higher than what we're typically stopping at 6 in Santa Clara? And that's probably going to be North Santa Clara, but if we want to get the low income and very low income, we have to start looking higher, because that is not going to cost us anything, and yet the developer's basic cost for the land has already been paid for. The question is, how many stories are we going to allow?
sorry, I had one more comment that I just thought of while he was as far as bang for the buck. When you were mentioning earlier the rules that say, the units have to be comparable to other units. If you're building a really high-end product, it's kind of a waste of, there's built-in rules within the tax credit laws in the state so that you cannot overspend on a project. And by you inserting language that says all the units have to be comparable, you're forcing a developer to spend more money on an affordable housing unit to be nicer when you could just put it into a fund and get more units, and that would be regulated by the state, so.
The problem is that the in lieu fees, as my understanding, are far less than what the developer would spend on that equivalent inclusionary. So you're right, you get a bigger bang for your buck, but the in lieu fees are so low that it doesn't generate that many units unless you get this huge leverage from state and federal grants.
Which is that's how all the federal, state and federal money is all computed. The most valuable thing on a tax credit application for scoring, because it's a competitive bid. There's 4% and 9% tax credits, and for 9% competitive tax credits, the thing you get the most points for, mixed use is like number 2, but number 1 is matched funding. So whatever you can get out of a city or any other federal agency or whatever it is, that's how you score the most competitively. So if we want to leverage stuff to the max, that's, I think, the way that it gets done.
Well, here are some of the funds that we can use potentially to help us build that housing. First, SB2, that was the urgency measure that's already gone into effect. It's just a $75 fee on recordation of real estate documents. It's expected to generate about $250 million per year. In 2018, 50% of this money is going to be allocated to local governments for funding planning activities and streamlining housing production. So potentially even Santa Clara's focus area planning and maybe even the zoning code update would qualify. In 2019, the funds will be awarded through a competitive grant program with priority given to low-income and rural areas, which we are not, but there's still some potential for competition for those funds. Senate Bill 3, this is going to put a bond measure on the ballot in November 2018 for $4 billion for various affordable housing programs. The proceeds will include the Cal Home Down Payment and Mortgage Assistance Program. There's $150 million that's going to be allocated to transit-oriented developments, as well as infrastructure supporting infill housing. These are sources of funding that the city can apply for, assuming the bond measure passes next year. Finally, AB 571, it's probably not too relevant here. Makes it easier to develop farm worker housing. I don't think we're doing much agricultural work anymore, so probably won't have that much impact here, but that's the third funding source.
Backyard gardens.
Backyard gardens, well.
Are the in lieu fees, are we capped? Is that based on the Nexus study results? Is that how we're capped on what we can charge?
The Nexus study identified the maximum that we can charge per square foot for the various types of development. The proposed ordinance adopts in lieu fees that are significantly below those maximums.
And why would we do that?
Why would we go below the maximums? Well, that was the product of the working group and compromise between the development community and affordable housing advocates.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Let me give you an example. The maximum supported fee for a hotel is $128 a square foot. If you charge that, no one would build a hotel in Santa Clara.
Right.
Sunnyvale charges $7.50. We set ours at $5.
Right. I know we're competing, but now that everyone is going to have this like artificial floor that they have to meet, I have a feeling that's going to change, because how else is anyone going to be compliant? And then if anyone wants to retain their land use powers and just not be subject to HCD revoking their privilege, they're going to have to do some aggressive things to get that done, and it's probably going to be fees going up, and maybe that means development in general slows down, and then we all get to have this conversation in Sacramento again. But it seems like we should do our best to raise that. I think the in lieu fee is the strongest way to get this done, and a developer knows what pencils out, and if we're taking away, if we're putting on us the ability to decide, oh, is this going to be in lieu or land, donation or units in there instead of giving it to them, I think you could just keep pushing the fee up until you start seeing they're going to opt into the in lieu fee every single time, until you reach a point. Well, if you keep raising it every year, eventually you're going to figure out what that point is. You can't see their pro forma or their budget, but you can figure it out. Eventually you're going to hit, and when they start saying, oh, we'll put it in our building, that's when you know you've reached the magic number. So I think that would be a good way to, you kind of have to take a first guess at what that number is. And if they instantly say we're going to put it in our building, you know you went too high, but I think that's a good way to start.
I think the neighborhood cities, as Commissioner Jan mentioned, that's a good parameter we can follow right away, basically. Because if development in Sunny Valley is coming up with 1.5 times than our rates, it doesn't harm for us to raise those rates right away. Yeah, I know what you're saying long term, you will find out that. But if the neighborhood cities are charging more than us, we should right away follow that, basically. It doesn't harm us.
On one of your slides for housing accountability, it talks about possible denials, and I think you have an example of denial necessary for compliance is, you say, insufficient water/sewer to serve the project. That's one of our possibilities for denial. Where do school districts fit into this? If the school district does not seem sufficient to handle the project, I know we don't have a direct coordination between the city and school districts, but where does the school district issue come in?
Yeah, actually there is another SB law which direct you cannot deny any development taking into school as like they don't have a school, or you cannot take that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there is AB, I don't forgot what that is, but there is.
The AB 50 covers basically that it sets the state legislature sets a standard per square foot on building permit fees, and that's supposed to be considered complete mitigation
Right.
for school impacts. So that's until that changes, we don't factor that into, yeah.
So what is our coordination with school districts then?
We collect the fee for them. That's all we
But the school
do.
district says they don't have sufficient.
That's not our jurisdiction. So because their argument has.
Certainly want to make us.
They do,
Yeah.
but their argument needs to be with their legislators. So because they're the ones that set the fee.
And the developers,
See what is the offsetting and the impact.
say the developers are paying more on the larger projects, and we're considering it
On a
as community-
voluntary basis,
voluntary,
yeah.
and we consider it a community benefit.
Mhm.
The other question I have is, does this in any way get towards the boarding house issue? This counts as units or?
No, because it's still considered one housekeeping unit, the way we're still looking at it. So, yeah, for now.
Forever or for now.
That's still an internal debate then.
Yeah.
Sandra, can we have a soft copy of these, if you have consolidated those, all ABs 1397 and all of them, and email to us, please?
The actual text of the bills? Is that what you mean? Or
Right, if you already consolidated, yeah, we can search always, but if you already.
Of course. I should warn you that they are very confusing. Most of them are arranged in this manner. Section A, Section 123 of the Government Code is amended as follows.
And you don't know it.
Section B, Section 123 of the Government Code is amended as follows. So you have two sections, both amending the same section of the Government Code. Then when you get to like Section Z, it says, oh, Section 1 applies if this bill is passed before this bill. But if this bill is passed after that bill, then Section 2 applies. So then you have to go figure out which bill was passed first. But then the other bill also, it's very confusing. I'm happy to submit this to you.
So basically.
It might be more useful if I give it to you on January 1st.
Oh.
Because on January 1st, all the new laws will simply be uploaded, and I can just give you, here's the one that they adopted. You won't have all the ridiculous alternate versions that took hours to go through and figure out.
You studied all that to create this for
I
us? Thank you
did.
very much.
Thank you very
Good
much.
times, my pleasure.
Or we can email you anytime.
You had one slide on here talking about there can be a suit against the city for not complying. And,
Just so I can see.
and one of the things is you have to pay the attorney fees.
Okay, sure.
Yes.
What I'm wondering is the plaintiff for those, what standing do they have to have before they can sue you? You know, you always worry about, you know, bounty lawyers and stuff.
Well, it has to be somebody that's applied for
But it has to
development
be-
project. It can't just be, you know, they have to actually submit
So they have to have
an application.
some association with the developer of some sort. They need to be representing somebody.
Oh, sure. There actually has to be an actual project that we've denied. It can't just be, you know, I have a feeling I want to do a project, trust me.
Okay.
You know, we've got, and you'll have to fill out all the standard
And it
application forms.
has to be a real
and-
project. So.
Yeah, we've got tons of
It's that area where it
requirements
kind
for
of
what
backs up
constitutes completeness for an
rail
application. I think they'd at very least have to have a complete application before they could sue us, or it wouldn't be ripe.
It's always a concern I have with state laws is that somebody's going to figure out how can they make money on them.
Oh, being a lawyer is quite profitable for many people.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yeah, this is
Would the member of the public like to speak on any of what we discussed or have any questions? Okay, great.
Motion to
Okay.
close public hearing?
We need to do that? I got confused.
You're
Under
good.
7,
Oh.
okay.
Okay.
All right,
Appreciate the sentiment.
okay, thank you. All right, let's go to item 8, reports. Anybody?
I was wondering, Suds, how those affordable meetings went to, you said you had one at Taplin's tonight? Is there
This
attendance?
evening, there was a meeting, well, sort of a get-together
Together?
sponsored by, I guess, the Greenbelt Alliance, which had done all of those walks along El Camino Real. So we basically talked about, you know, how those went and next steps, and we also talked about what happened at City Council last night. So, and I'm sure that
So there was attendance.
Ms. Chiara will represent what happened at council.
Okay, all right, thank you. Anything else? Anyone else? Okay, let's move on to item.
I just have a
oh,
question. Did
yes.
Lance get signed in? Are you all
I'm
in?
all official.
Okay.
Great,
Thank
yes.
you. Congratulations.
Yep, welcome again.
I'm
Okay.
officially the vacant seat in the website.
Get your picture taken.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, so item 9.
Okay, Cherokee, so just following up from council meeting, and I apologize, I don't have the report from the 21st, but I'll just cover what happened last night at the December 5th city council meeting. And items on consent, actually Commissioner Jane's Mills Act contract was approved. There's a special permit for Santa Clara University, and this is for some off-site classrooms for them while they're working on their master plan. And then there was a Parks Master Plan for the Lawrence Station area plan that is being proposed. And so there was a recommendation for the Parks Commission to use artificial turf, but the city staff there was a preference for natural turf, so the council approved it with that, with the staff recommendation. On the public hearing items, there, in relationship to the Lawrence Area Station Plan, there was also a street vacation of both Copper Road and I think it was Gordon.
What does
And
that mean when they say vacation? I didn't quite understand.
Oh, that means that they're basically relinquishing public right-of-way to the private developer, since a portion of it was supposed to be incorporated into Summer Hills project. Theirs was in the mid 900 unit count range, all different densities. That was approved by city council.
I thought it was going the other way.
So that, no, the city, so they will purchase that property from the city. So we're saying that because we're making the streets less wide. So
Yeah, actually, I know the nuance of this one. They're actually providing land to us that will become a new road. We are vacating a lesser amount of property because they are giving us more property than we are giving up. There's no exchange of money. But yeah, it's actually, the action that we took was to vacate the roads that we're not going to use as roads anymore. And they are dedicating new road to the city.
Thank you. Then the affordable housing ordinance, so they did support the staff recommendation with a change in the affordability level for the for sale. The original proposal from the working group was 12.5%, and they did push that up to 15%. And there's also a direction to return to City Council in 90 days with an analysis of the potential reduction in affordability requirement for projects that pay standard wage, so prevailing wage.
Decision was left to the planning department or the city to
I think
make that decision.
I think they have to come back when there's supposed to be a nexus study or something
Right. What the city manager, I believe, told the council was that they're going to bring back an estimate of the cost of performing the calculations, maybe a full-fledged nexus study, in order to calculate what kind of reduction we can get for providing prevailing wage. Because right now there's just no data to establish.
I meant the other one where one of their choices was to pay an in lieu fee versus an inclusionary.
Oh, okay, yeah, so that's another component that changed, because initially with the working group, there was an option of either or. So, so now the city, as Xander mentioned, is that the city would have the discretion to choose. Of course, they're going to work with the developer, but it'll be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, so it'll be up to the city for whether they're going to provide the units on-site versus an in lieu fee. And let's see here. Okay, and then the other action, you didn't see this, but there is a proposed ENA, an exclusive negotiating agreement with the city and VTA for the parcel that's a parking lot currently at the Railroad Avenue in El Camino Real. And VTA has been looking at partnering with local jurisdictions and affordable housing developers as well to maximize these properties that are near transit stations. And the proposal, at least right now, is just for the city to enter into this agreement. And there is a developer that would be looking at developing that site with affordable, like say, student housing. So right now, this is just looking at the feasibility, much what happened at that Monroe and what was the crossroad? San Tomas Expressway, yes. That
Be VTA funding.
right now they're just in an agreement with the city to explore what possibilities would be available and what would be in for each jurisdiction. So what would the city get out of it? So it's basically it's the time to develop a proposal for a certain amount of period of time.
Can I clarify that? I'm sorry. So this is the property across from the police station. It's 2/3 owned by the city, 1/3 owned by VTA. And so the council voted to approve the ENA, and the current proposal is 680 beds for students, but it would be at market rate for that property. So that I believe, I don't know if that's a firm proposal or if that's just the starting point for what they're going to build, but it would be at market rate and primarily targeted for students.
How many stories is that?
I don't know.
So, and that's it from the city council wrap up.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Someone asked me something the other day, and I don't know the answer, and I said I would ask. Am I the only person up here that rents? All right. I thought so, but I didn't want to tell them.
We have a very diverse group, and that's an important piece of it, I think.
All right.
Age and
Does anyone know if that's the same for the city council? Does anyone on the city?
Actually, it came up last
Yeah.
night, and all of the council members are owners.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So,
okay.
because most of the time, most of the attendance of
I think single
Any of it
family,
are
and primarily
homeowners.
single family. I think that also the housing diversity was brought up about
Yeah.
what type of home ownership was there. So I think it's primarily
For how long?
single family.
even though my understanding is 50% of the residents of Santa Clara are renters.
Mm-hmm.
Our housing stock is actually higher on the rental side.
Do we know that number? I was curious to ask that too.
Of
How much?
all
of-
the housing stock, I ran across it just recently, and we can bring that back for you, but I believe it was over 60% rental.
Wow, okay.
But we can confirm that and bring that back to you.
Okay, motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will meet on the 20th? Are we likely to have that meeting? Okay, all right. See you on the 20th.
Thank you, Xander.
Oh, my pleasure.
We don't know.
Frankly, it's all stuff that I needed to know, so I was happy to learn it, and kind of alarmed.
Gloria, the National Planning Convention